Hi everyone, welcome and thanks for joining. Today I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips and tricks that you can use when working with Nintex Workflow. And before we get started, I have one quick housekeeping announcement to cover. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but please feel free to use that chat window to submit any questions that you may have, and we'll be sure to answer those at the end. So just a quick little bit about Abel Solutions before we get started. For over 2 decades, clients have trusted us to help them reduce the cost, risk, and implementation time associated with solving their most critical business, IT, and collaboration challenges. We help companies achieve powerful business improvement through document management and workflow-enabled SharePoint solutions, unique applications, technology planning and support, and a wide array of complementary IT services. Among our growing list of industry-specific solutions, we offer pre-built collaboration frameworks that shrink implementation time and cost. Now, as a long-standing Microsoft Gold partner focused on improving business productivity, Abel Solutions now also offers services that help you achieve better IT cost control. And in addition to our partnership with Microsoft, we're also Nintex's go-to partner in the Southeast and longest-serving partner in the region, delivering Nintex software, services, and training since 2008. Now just a quick little bit about who I am. My name is Nicole Prestby. I'm a senior SharePoint consultant here at Abel Solutions, where Nintex is one of my primary areas of expertise. As I mentioned, Abel Solutions is one of Nintex's premier partners, and we've had a very close relationship for many, many years. And because of the work that I've been able to do here at Abel, I'm also a virtual technical evangelist for Nintex, which is equivalent to Microsoft's MVP program and basically means that I'm very active in community events. I handle the pre-sales demos and discussions for Abel Solutions, and I lead the charge on our Nintex consulting and training service offerings. My blog is listed here. Feel free to check that out. I typically post tips and tricks to help you on your SharePoint and Nintex journey, very similar to what we'll be talking about today. And then for more information about Abel Solutions or Nintex, you can check out the websites listed at the bottom of this slide, follow us on Twitter, or contact us directly, and I'll be sure to share some contact information with you at the end of our webinar. All right, now on to the agenda for today. We will start with just a few slides to cover a quick overview of the Nintex product suite for those who may not be familiar. Then we'll dive into all the great tips and tricks for Nintex Workflow, including considerations before even opening up the design canvas, tips on debugging and effective testing, best practices as you develop your workflow, and a personal favorite of mine, tips for efficiency. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with a bit of Q&A. Now, one thing to point out, this webinar is primarily focused on tips and tricks when working with the on-prem versions of Nintex. We will have tips and tricks specific to the Office 365 version of Nintex, as well as the Forms product in future webinars. All right, for those of you who may be newer to Nintex, I just want to give a quick overview of everything that the Nintex Workflow platform currently has to offer. First, we've got Nintex Workflow, which is our flagship product, which allows you to build out and automate your business processes quickly and easily. Nintex Forms provides a user interface to kick off those workflows with powerful business logic built right into that data capture stage. Nintex Mobile extends your workflows and forms so that users can stay connected no matter where they are and take those processes on the go. Nintex Hawkeye is workflow analytics, which is going to provide the ability to get a 30,000-foot view of every inch of every workflow in your environment. Nintex App Studio extends that Nintex mobile capability by allowing you to easily create custom, targeted, and powerful mobile process applications. Nintex Document Generation simplifies and automates that document generation process using dynamic process data. And then finally, we've got several Nintex connectors, which allow for seamless integration to other cloud-based applications that your organization may be using, essentially allowing you to create workflows without boundaries. Now, we've done previous webinar on several of these topics, and I encourage you to check those out on our YouTube channel. You can find us at Abel Solutions LLC on YouTube. All right, so let's jump into the meat of our topic for today, tips and tricks for Nintex Workflow. Now, before you even open up the Nintex Workflow Designer, I have a few prep tips that I'd like you to consider that will ultimately help make your Nintex implementations more successful. First things first, Make sure you're using an appropriate browser. The supported and recommended browsers are going to vary depending on the specific version of Nintex that you're using. So for SharePoint 2010 and 2013, you're definitely going to need to use IE. And while you'll notice that IE 7 is technically supported for Nintex 2010 and IE 8 for 2013, the official recommendation is going to be Internet Explorer 8 or above for 2010 and IE 9 or above for 2013. Now, if you try to use something like Firefox or Chrome, you will experience kind of varying degrees of not workingness, so keep that in mind. Now, once you get to the newer product versions like 2016 and Office 365, you will need to make sure that you're using a newer version of IE, but you'll also notice that you gain some flexibility and you can use Firefox, Chrome, and even Safari and Edge for 2016. Browser compatibility for Nintex Workflow is the same for design and runtime. So that means that these are the browsers that you should use to create and manage your workflows, as well as what your users should be using to kick them off, interact with tasks, and so on. And as you can see here at the bottom of the slide is a link to where I've pulled this information from. You can find similar details for the other Nintex products at Nintex Connect as well if you need those. All right, so now let's jump over into a quick demo. All right, so this is a SharePoint 2016 on-prem environment, and I'm on the site settings page for my site. Now, if I scroll down to the Nintex Workflow section, there's two settings that I'd like to point out. First and foremost, one of the settings we see here is workflow error notifications. This setting is going to be used to allow you to define who gets notified when one of your workflows errored. Now, the default is actually to notify the initiator or the requester who kicked off the process. This is not always helpful. It's going to confuse the users. They're not going to know what to do with that email. They definitely probably won't know how to fix that issue that's causing the workflow to error. Really, it's you who need to be notified if one of your workflow fails. So what I recommend that you do is flip this over to no. We don't need to bother the initiator. They don't need visibility into when our workflows behind the scenes are erroring out, which happens from time to time. So set that over to no, and then you would just add your email address right in here. And you can add multiple email addresses, and you can separate them by semicolons if you want to email kind of your whole team of users so that somebody can pick that up and be notified and look into kind of what's happening with why your workflow might be erroring out. All right. Now, if I go back to my site settings page, go back down to my Nintex Workflow section, the other thing I want to point out is the workflow inventory. So this shows all workflows across the entire site, including site workflows and list workflows. And you'll notice here that you can even view workflows for your entire site collection if you want to. This page is going to show us where the workflows live, in which parent list or library, who last modified the workflow and when, the latest published and saved minor versions, as well as the last time that each workflow ran. There are times when it can be super helpful to be able to see an aggregated view like this of all your Nintex workflows across the entire site, rather than having to go through each individual list or library to see what you've got in place. We actually just leveraged this for a client where we needed to swap out hard-coded user credentials for Workflow Constant, which is typically a better practice. So we needed to first identify all the workflows where that user credential was hard-coded, and this inventory page saved us a lot of time when we were working through each workflow. Another scenario where this may be helpful is, let's say you know that you've created a workflow to do a specific process, or you know that you've done some certain bit of logic or solved some problem in one of your workflows, and now you need to leverage that for another workflow, but you cannot for the life of you remember where that workflow lives or which workflow you built that piece of logic into. This happens to me all the time. This page gives you quick access to all of your workflows for the whole site, so you can very easily kind of run through each one and assess and find the one that you need. And what you can do is you can actually click on the workflow name here, and it's going to open up the visual representation of that full workflow. You can see the high-level kind of visual and do a quick assessment to see if this is the one that you need or not. And if you need to make changes, you can actually jump right in and start editing this workflow from this page as well, which is very cool. All right. So now let's talk about some tips that you can use when you're testing your workflow. Now, even though the majority of our workflows are going to be triggered automatically, for example, every time an item is added into a list, what I like to do is test my logic of my workflow before testing the automatic start functionality. So let me explain. What you may not realize is that even if your ultimate goal is for the workflow to kick off automatically on item start or item modification, while you're testing, rather than adding new items over and over, filling out that form every time, which can be lots of fields, it can take a long time, you can actually manually kick off a workflow on a single item in your list over and over to verify that the logic of your workflow is working as you need it to. Then, once you've confirmed that your workflow is functioning as needed based on your technical requirements, you can configure and test the automatic start. So here we see that in addition to the options to configure our auto start options, we also have this setting to allow for manual start, which is enabled by default, I should point out. And so typically I just leave that set as the default setting to allow manual start, and that's going to give me that flexibility during my development and my unit testing. Now, one other cool feature that I want to point out here is that we have the option to add essentially a quick link from the item menu with this enable workflow to start from the item menu option down here below. So this is going to actually save us another click or two when we're going through our unit testing, because instead of having to, in this case, we would have to click advanced and then select workflows and then select the workflow from the list of available workflows and then click start. I can give myself a quick link here in the item menu, and I can simply click that shortcut and then click start, and we're off and running. The other thing that I like to do is have two browser tabs open when I'm working. So one will be the workflow designer, and the other will be the list where that workflow lives. So this is going to allow me to very quickly switch back and forth between publishing my changes in the designer and then testing them out on my list item. Now, this may seem super minor and super obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times I've been working with someone and watched as they completely close the workflow designer, navigate to the list, test their changes, and then have to open up the designer all over again to make some tweaks. It's just not very efficient, and I'm all about efficiency. So the last thing I want to point out on this topic of testing and troubleshooting is where you can find some important information about your Nintex product. So from within the Nintex Workflow Designer, if you click the drop down here under Help in the ribbon and then select About Nintex Workflow, you will find the current version, licensing information, your software assurance status, and this is helpful in a couple of main scenarios. So first of all, support. Anytime you submit a support ticket with Nintex, the first thing they're going to want to know is your current build version and your license ID so that they can verify your support status. The other reason that I reference this information is when I think that an issue that I'm experiencing may be a bug. If you find yourself in that situation, what I recommend is that you review the release notes for that specific problem where you're experiencing the issue. Now, these are easily found with a quick Google search of your Nintex product. So if you just search, for example, Nintex Workflow 2016 plus release notes, and then you can even do a find on the page to search for the actual kind of bug or issue that you're experiencing. And what you'll find is that oftentimes the issue that you're experiencing has been resolved with a newer release of the product. And then so bringing this back over to kind of how we would leverage this within the help within the Workflow Designer, once you find the release that includes the resolution for your issue, you would want to come back and compare that to your current build version. And sometimes it's just a simple product update is all that's needed to solve your problem. So now let's talk about some best practices and considerations as you start to build out your Nintex workflows. Variables are going to be key in any workflow that you build out with Nintex, as they're going to allow you to go retrieve data from some data source, whether it's a SharePoint list, an external database, Active Directory, or any other number of data sources. And then you store that data in order to use it in the conditions and actions within your workflow. Different types of data can be stored into workflow variables, and they also can be used to get data from users on workflow start. Now, the biggest tip here is to develop and implement a naming convention. We've developed a naming convention that you can see kind of an example up here on the slide that all of our workflow designers use when designing Nintex workflows, which we train all of our clients on, and essentially consists of a prefix designating the variable type. This can become really helpful as you're scanning through your workflow, if you're troubleshooting and debugging, or just as you're building out or trying to hand off workflows, to have this consistent naming convention and to understand what type of data is being stored in each variable. All right, the next thing I want to talk about and encourage you to do is to save early and save often. So save, as opposed to publishing your workflow, is just going to save your progress. It's not making your changes live to your users yet, so there's no reason that you shouldn't be saving. And there's no automatic save happening within Nintex Workflow. There's also no undo in the on-prem version. Now, on the 365, on the SharePoint Online version of Nintex Workflow, there is actually the option to undo and redo, which is nice. But if you're working on-prem, as we're talking about today, there is no undo and there's no automatic save. So save early, save often. The other thing is that Nintex Workflow is a browser-based program, right? So browser crashes can happen. The internet can inexplicably go down sometimes. And when that happens, if you've made a lot of changes, you can configured lots of actions and you have it saved recently, you're going to lose a lot of work and it's going to set you back and it's going to frustrate you. So just save early, save often. Again, it's one of those really kind of basic tips, but it's a really powerful one. Okay, labeling. So I said in a presentation once that if I were an Nintex politician, one of my platforms would be the importance of labeling. Labeling your actions is super important and super easy. You actually have 4 different labels that you can set for each action. You can customize the top, bottom, left, and right label for every individual action in your designer. And you've got 2 ways to edit. First of all, you can edit them inline on the workflow action itself by simply clicking on that top label, and that's going to activate that label for you. And then you can even tab to get to the other labels and to jump through all your actions and update all your labels that way. The other way that you can update these labels is within the configuration action dialog for the action itself. And you would simply just want to click over to that labels tab in the ribbon of the action configuration, and you have access to all the same labels here. And really, I probably update in both ways. It's probably 50-50. It just depends on kind of where I am and what I'm doing when I think of making those updates to the labels. Now, updating your labels can be useful in several scenarios. Let's say you build a workflow, you leave it alone for several months, and then now you need to make modifications or you need to troubleshoot an error that's all of a sudden happening. Do yourself a favor and make it easy for yourself to pick up where you left off. Or let's say you build a workflow and then someone else has to maintain that or make changes. Do them a favor and make it easy to figure out what you were doing and what you were thinking when you built out the workflow in the first place. And then the last reason that these are really, really helpful is that your workflow history is going to become more useful because instead of, essentially what happens is it takes this top title, this top action label, and prints that out in our action history in the Nintex Workflow History view. And so instead of seeing, send notification, assign flexi task, send notification, set variable, and so on, that action history detail is going to become more meaningful. Okay, so as I just mentioned, and hopefully you're all familiar, but basically when you're ready to save your workflow, you have 2 options, right? You've got the option to save and publish. Save, as we just talked about, it's just going to save a minor version. It's saving your progress. And then publish is going to publish a major version, which is going to make it live for your users. Now, in either case, you're going to have the option to store change comments with each version. And let's just take a quick look at kind of how that works and how that can be useful. All right, so over here in my Workflow Designer, if I select Open from the ribbon of my Workflow Designer, I see that I've got a list of all of my workflows for the list that I'm currently on. And you'll notice that each workflow has a plus sign to the left of the name. Now, when I click on one of those plus signs, this section is going to expand and it's going to show me all previous minor and major versions of that workflow that I could potentially open up and even restore if I need to. Now, when we hover over each of these versions, we can actually see the change comments that we stored when we saved that version. This can be super helpful to track exactly which additions and changes that you made and when. Sometimes you may need to roll back to a previous version because the requirements changed, or maybe they changed back. That happens sometimes. People say they want something and then you give it and then they say, no, I don't want that. This can save you some time rather than having to undo all those actions. Or maybe the last change that was pushed out broke a bunch of stuff. Maybe the regression testing wasn't there and you need to revert back to the latest working version. In any case, I strongly recommend that you just get in the habit of jotting a few quick comments each time you save your workflow. It's a really great feature that's provided, so you might as well use that. Okay. And then the last thing that I want to make you aware of in this category is how Nintex behaves if you change the title of your workflow. So changing the title of your workflow is going to create a new and completely separate copy of the workflow, which can be good or bad depending on what you're trying to do. Essentially, this acts like our save as function that you may be used to in like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. So if you want to create a copy of your workflow, then great. This is how you'll do it. However, it's important to be aware that there's no good way to change the name of your workflow once you have saved it. The other thing to be aware of is that your version history will not come over to the new separate kind of instance of that workflow. So for example, in this scenario, I created a workflow and I called it Basic PTO Request Workflow. I made several changes, I saved several versions, and then I realized that I was actually using the wrong terminology. We don't call it PTO, we call it leave request. Real bonehead move on my part. I just, kind of spaced out that day. So when I changed the name of my workflow, it actually created a completely separate copy of the workflow, and all of my version history is stuck on that old workflow. So like I said, it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just something that you want to be aware of how it's going to handle that. All right. So I kind of feel like I've been sharing tips to improve efficiency all along the way. That's always my goal. But let's talk through just a couple more. Oftentimes, we have parts of our process that are very similar and we can speed up our efforts by reusing actions that we've already configured and then simply making a few minor tweaks. So for example, emails. Let's say we've got our approval task here where we've got two options, how the manager can either approve our request or reject it. In either case, we want to send kind of a similar email notification back to the requester whether the request is approved or rejected. Now, in this case, you could simply configure one email, say the rejection notification, and then when you click on the drop down, you're going to get the option to copy that configured action. And then you would simply come over to your approval side, click on one of your drop zones, and then you'll have the option to paste the action in. And then you could simply double click on the action icon, open it up, make whatever minor tweaks you need if you just need to change every time you referenced rejected to approved, and then you're off and running. There are a few other kind of common scenarios where I find this useful. Still along the email vein, but submission and cancellation notifications. So a lot of times we want to send an email notification to our requester to let them know, hey, thanks, we got your request. And then maybe a similar notification back to that same person if the request has been canceled for any reason. So again, you could configure that action once and then just copy it over and make a few minor tweaks. This can be really helpful in the case of emails too. If you're putting in a lot of effort creating kind of nicely formatted email notifications, maybe you create a real fancy table or you've included lots of links, this can help you not have to go through all those efforts again. Another case where this can be helpful is when you're setting field values. So for example, we do this a lot where when the item is approved or rejected, we want to update maybe a request status field on the item with an appropriate value. This is going to allow the users at any time to come back to that list and kind of check on the status and see where we are throughout our workflow. Now, if it's just two values, it may not be that valuable, but if you think about having maybe a large state machine workflow with many levels of approval where we need to kind of update this throughout the process, this is going to save you a ton of time. And then the last instance where I've used this quite frequently is on a query list. So let's say you are querying the same list that you've queried before, but you need maybe slightly different filter parameters. This kind of technique can help you there as well. All right. And then the last thing I want to touch on is snippets. So snippets provide the capability to create reusable groups of actions. You have two options for how you can save a snippet. You can either choose to save your entire workflow as a snippet, in which case, from your workflow designer, you would hit the drop down underneath the save option in the ribbon and choose save as snippet, and then just give your snippet a name. Or more frequently, rather than saving my entire workflow, I just want to save a little portion of my workflow so that I can reuse that portion over and over. In that case, I can just throw whatever actions I want to package up and reuse into an action set, action. And then on my action set, when I click the little drop down of options, I have the option to save that action set as a snippet. And once again, I would just give it a name. The nice thing about these snippets is that they're not workflow specific. My snippets are going to be available throughout my entire site collection, available for any workflow in my site collection. Now, by default, and the way that they show up is that once you create snippets, you'll see this category here in your actions toolbox for my snippets. You won't see this category by default, but as soon as you create that first snippet, you'll get this new category called my snippets. And the other thing that I want to point out is kind of the scoping idea of snippets. So they are called my snippets, meaning they're available just to me. So everyone can have snippets, but we don't have access to each other. So my snippets are going to be different than Joe's snippets and different than Sue's snippets. So those are different than if you wanted to save a workflow as a template, then that would become available to all of your users. So slight difference in scoping there. Snippets are just for me and my personal reuse, but throughout my whole site collection. These can be really powerful in a few different ways, particularly saving portions of your workflow through an action set. A few ways that I use these quite frequently is, for example, chunks of formatting logic. So let's say I have certain data that's coming in that I want to format in a certain way to send in my emails. For example, one thing that we do quite frequently is Boolean values that come through. So our yes, no fields come through and Nintex presents them to us as true, false. If we want to present that to a user in an email notification, rather than giving them a value of true, false, we might want to convert that to a yes, no value. And if I want to use that over and over in lots of different workflows, if I have a kind of a wide need for that small minor functionality, but I don't want to configure those few actions every time, I can just wrap them up in a snippet and throw that snippet on every time I have that need for that function. The other case where you can use this is common queries. And particularly if you've got, let's say you've got like a master list somewhere, whether it's in the same site or in a completely different site collection, maybe it's a master department list that you're going to reference from lots of different workflows throughout your site or throughout your site collection, and you want to build out the query once and then not have to build out that query every time, you could wrap that up in an action set, save it as a snippet, and then be able to leverage that over and over in your workflows without having to go through the whole effort of reproducing that work every time. Again, I'm all about efficiency, so I love it. All right. So with that, we have reached the end of our content for today. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully you've learned some great new tricks that you'll be able to take back with you to improve your Nintex implementations. Please feel free to contact us if we can help you with any of your SharePoint or Nintex projects. And now let's take a few questions. I think I've been seeing some questions coming in. So first of all, is this being recorded? Yep, so this webinar is being recorded. We'll be emailing the recording out and then it'll be posted to our YouTube channel. Let's see, there's a question here. So, okay, so as I mentioned, the tips and tricks that I was sharing today are primarily focused for Nintex Workflow for the on-prem versions of Nintex. There's a question that's come through. I have Nintex for Office 365. Are all these features available in that version of Nintex? So no, the short answer is no, not necessarily. So for example, the site settings I pointed out early on, the change comment functionality, the snippets, are currently not available in the Office 365 version of Nintex. Again, it's August of 2017. But as Nintex moves closer and closer to parity between their on-prem and their 365 offerings of Nintex Workflow, I'm sure they're going to be added in there soon, those minor missing features. Definitely stay tuned for another webinar in the future focusing on tips and tricks specifically for the Office 365 version. And then also worth mentioning, check out abelsolutions.com for details. We offer 3-day Nintex training classes, and we now offer them for both the on-prem and the 365 offerings of Nintex. So check that out if you think that you might have that need. All right, what else? Okay, how to save an entire workflow as a snippet. So I think I covered that. If you, from your workflow designer, it's a drop down underneath the save action. So rather than just hitting the save button in your ribbon when you're in the workflow designer, if you hit the drop down, you have a couple of additional options there. One of those options is to save your workflow as a snippet, and that'll save the whole thing. And one thing to point out about the snippets too is that when you save your entire workflow as a snippet, let's say you've got 5 actions in your workflow, when you add that snippet onto your design canvas to use it in another workflow, those 5 actions are just going to add onto your canvas kind of standalone as if you added them all individually into that workflow designer. When you save a snippet via the action set, so when you save a portion of your workflow by wrapping it into an action set and then saving that action set as a snippet, when you use that snippet later, when you drag the snippet onto your canvas later, it's actually going to keep those wrapped in an action set. So it actually drags that action set onto your canvas, and then you can expand it to see the actions within. So there's a little slight kind of difference in the way that the snippet functionality works when you're saving your whole workflow versus a portion of it with an action set. All right, so there's a question here. So can the workflows be configured to integrate with bots? For example, an inquiry is sent to the SharePoint mailbox, and instead of a person issuing a response, the bot would respond based on a custom knowledge base. Okay, so short answer, yes. I think you should be able to, either with Nintex Workflow Cloud or with the Enterprise Edition of Nintex Workflow, you could potentially set up an external start trigger. I definitely feel like it's possible to do that integration. I would say check out Nintex Workflow Cloud, or if you've got the Enterprise Edition, look into the external start capability. I would need to investigate it further to be sure on that particular scenario. And so definitely reach out. Carol Redaway's contact information is up here on the screen, so definitely reach out to Carol if that's something that we could help you with, because we'd be happy to. And then another one here. So for workflow errors, is there a best practice for the address to send to, i.e. group email box, system admin, other? Yeah, so I don't think there's necessarily a best practice. It just needs to be a valid email. I think if you are the sole person responsible for creating workflows and maintaining workflows in your site, then you could just put yourself there. Now, one thing to point out with those error notifications also is you may or may not have noticed, you can actually set that specification at the individual site level, or at the full site collection level, or for the entire farm. And then it kind of inherits down the way that SharePoint typically does. So if, for example, in just your team site, you're the only person creating workflows in that team site, you're the only person who would need to know when something goes wrong, then I would just put yourself in there. If we're talking about a whole site collection and you're a part of the IT team and there's 5 of you guys who are building out workflows for lots of different departments and lines of business, then if you had kind of an email-enabled group and there's an email kind of group mailbox, then you could certainly put that in there and you could all be notified, or you could put yourselves individually. So I don't know that there's necessarily a best practice. It really depends. As long as it's valid email address, and then it's really just whoever needs to kind of get involved when something goes wrong. That's who you want in there. All right. So we'll wait just another couple of seconds and see if any other kind of questions come through. Okay. All right. Well, I thank you all for joining. I hope that you learned some interesting things that you'll be able to take back with you. Definitely reach out if we can help you further. Check out our other webinars on our YouTube channel. And until next time, thanks so much. Y'all have a great day.